Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, to the Wilmette Institute's second webinar at the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley. We are very excited to have Dr. Karlberg presenting on the topic of one of his recent articles, Responding to Injustice with Constructive Agency, published with Dr. Derik Smith, who gave the last lecture, and published in the World of the Baha'i Faith, edited by our very own Wilmette Institute's director, Dr. Stockman. Dr. Michael Karlberg is a professor of communication studies at Western Washington University. His scholarship examines prevailing concepts of human nature, power, social organization, and social change, and their implications for the pursuit of peace and justice. He authored the books Beyond the Culture of Contest and Constructing Social Reality, an Inquiry into the Normative Foundations of Social Change, as well as numerous articles and related themes. I particularly love his TED Talk and included in my syllabus, and loved the discussions I had with my students about his work. He's currently working on a book tentatively entitled Ends and Means, Social Justice in an Age of Transition. Without further ado, Michael Karlberg, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chitra. And I want to thank the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley and the Wilmette Institute for inviting me to speak. At the outset, I also just want to acknowledge, that as we gather here, many of us are thinking about the people of Ukraine and about many others around the world who are suffering from various forms of violence and oppression. I happened to be speaking to another gathering yesterday, along with a colleague inside Ukraine who lives there, who was sharing on-the-ground observations of constructive agency in Ukraine today. And his account reminded me of some really remarkable ethnographic work done by an anthropologist named Carolyn Nordstrom, who happens to be a Berkeley alum. Nordstrom conducted research in Mozambique during its 15-year civil war from 1977 to 1992. And it was one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century. It claimed the lives of over 1 million people, destroyed much of the country's crops, homes, schools, hospitals, water supplies, and other infrastructure. Many people who study wars like that focus on the military campaigns and strategies, political choices and machinations of leaders and politicians. But of course, the majority of people who experience war are not soldiers or politicians. They're ordinary people whose story is never told and whose agency is never recognized. So Nordstrom set out to tell their story and to document the forms of agency they exhibited during the war. And she published this in a book titled A Different Kind of War Story, which I highly recommend. It's very germane to the theme of what I'll be speaking about tonight. Based on her extensive observations and interviews on the ground during the war in Mozambique, she tells a story of radical constructive agency and resilience. It's a story of ordinary people engaged in the extraordinary work of building new patterns of community life amidst violence and conflict. And it's a story of ordinary people finding morally courageous and creative ways not only to survive, but to restore peace, to rebuild, to heal, and to lay the foundations for a new society. And of course, similar forms of agency are being expressed in Ukraine today and will continue to be expressed in the weeks and months and years to come. And it's this form of agency that I want to talk about, but not specifically in Ukraine, because transformative expressions of constructive agency can emerge in any oppressive context. And I want to relate this concept, constructive agency, which I'll elaborate on a bit, to the evolving discourse on nonviolent responses to oppression that many of you are probably familiar with to some extent. So to do this, I'm going to initially share insights from the accumulating experience of the worldwide Baha'i community and then I'll discuss the wider implications of those insights or other movements for social justice. So, for those of you who are not familiar with the Baha'i community, it comprises a growing movement of people across the planet, representing a microcosm of humanity, working to translate commonly held spiritual principles into a new social reality through an evolving framework of action. So, oppression is a significant theme across the entire corpus of primary Baha'i writings. And the Baha'i writings allude to both generalized and acute forms of oppression. So generalized forms of oppression include the perversion of truth, lack of access to education and knowledge, the cultivation of materialistic worldviews and lifestyles, and the burden of excessive military spending, all of which inhibit the development of human potentialities across entire populations. And acute forms of oppression include violence or discrimination targeted at specific groups through racism, sexism, xenophobia, caste systems, other forms of bigotry, social exclusion, and exploitation. Now, the Baha'i writings suggest that all these forms of oppression, generalized and acute, arise from similar underlying causes, which are sometimes understood through one of two different metaphors. First, oppression can be understood as a symptom of underlying spiritual disease in the body of society. And second, oppression can be understood as an expression of immature stages in our collective spiritual development. Now, with either of these metaphors, either of these understandings, complacency in the face of oppression constitutes for Baha'is neglect of a fundamental spiritual obligation. So the Baha'i writings repeatedly exhort us to overcome complacency and actively work for social transformation and justice. And at the same time, Baha'is are exhorted to avoid contentious means as they work for justice. So this latter point can best be understood in light of the Baha'i teachings on the oneness of humanity, which is the pivotal organizing principle of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. The principle of oneness implies that all of humanity constitutes an organically interdependent social body, in which the well-being of every individual and social group derives from the well-being of the entire social body. So oneness is not uniformity. In fact, it's the opposite. An interdependent social body is made whole and healthy by the diversity of its members, with every individual and social group making distinct contributions that enrich all of humanity. But that's only possible if the social body is organized around the principle of justice, which can ensure that every individual and social group has the opportunity to develop their latent capacities to contribute to the betterment of humanity as a whole. So, understood this way, for Baha'is, oneness and justice are reciprocal or co-requisite principles. They constitute the ends Baha'is are pursuing, and they also inform the means by which those ends are pursued. So for Baha'is, justice, it needs to be pursued in unifying ways. Now, to some people, that might sound like a logical contradiction, because a lot of people today believe social unity, if it's possible at all, can only be achieved after justice is achieved. And the pursuit of justice, many believe, requires conflict. But Baha'is believe that unity and justice can be pursued simultaneously, and that our means of social change can prefigure our ends in that regard. Or stated another way, our means and ends can be coherent. So how do Baha'is actually do this in practice? Well, to understand this is where I want to sort of take a little detour into the discourse on nonviolent social change. So the literature on nonviolent social change would characterize the Baha'i approach as a constructive program. It's a concept that was initially coined by Gandhi, although Baha'is had been operating in this mode for many decades before Gandhi. But the basic premise underlying Gandhi's work is, like the Baha'is, also the need for coherence between means and ends, which is why he was committed to nonviolence. As Gandhi gained experience with nonviolent methods, and as his thinking matured, he recognized that the most radical dimension of nonviolent social change was the active construction of a more just society from the bottom up that could supplant the oppressive social order. He referred to that as the constructive program. The work an oppressed population has to do to build a more just order. Now, Gandhi contrasted this society-building work with contentious forms of nonviolent action, such as civil disobedience, which he also employed, and they were intended to resist and disrupt the oppressive order. But Gandhi came to review contentious resistance as secondary to the constructive program. And in this sense, the Baha'i approach can be characterized as a nonviolent constructive program in the way Gandhi used the term. Now, the Baha'i community understands its constructive work in terms of three broad overlapping spheres of activity. First, Baha'is are focused on building more just patterns of community life, along with new institutional structures and practices to support them on an ever-expanding scale across the entire planet. Second, as these community building processes advance, so does the capacity to engage in diverse forms of social action addressing the social and economic needs of the wider population. And third, as the Baha'i community develops in both of these ways, its capacity to participate in the discourses of society also increases. And in the process, it contributes to the evolution of thought and the advancement of knowledge within wider populations. So through all three of these spheres of constructive activity, Baha'is are seeking to address the root causes of injustice and oppression. Now, these expressions of constructive agency are premised on an expanded understanding of power itself. Prevailing conceptions of power tend to focus narrowly on its competitive and conflictual expressions. But that narrow focus obscures unifying and mutualistic powers of the human spirit that need to be marshaled and channeled into the construction of a more peaceful and just social order. These latter powers are powers of attraction. And through these powers of attraction, ever-expanding numbers of people can be drawn away from passive acceptance of the oppressive order and into the active construction of a more just order. This approach is based on an implicit premise that as growing numbers of people begin to participate in the new order, the old order will atrophy through attrition as fewer people support and participate in it. So radical social transformation can be achieved through processes of construction, attraction, and attrition. But a radical constructive program of this kind also requires resilience because it will encounter repression. As the Baha'i program has advanced, privileged elites in some countries who benefit from oppressive social arrangements have recognized that there will be no place for such privilege in a more just social order. Now, in some cases, the hearts and minds of privileged elites have been attracted to this constructive movement and they've thrown in their lot with it. But others have attempted to repress this constructive movement, sometimes through violent means, as can be seen for over a century and a half in Iran, where the Baha'i faith was born. So radical constructive agency needs to be coupled with resilience in the face of active and sometimes violent repression. Now, my purpose in sharing these insights is not to highlight the Baha'i community, actually. For me, the concept of radical constructive agency, which I've been illustrating with the Baha'i example, expands what social theorists call our social imaginary. Our social imaginary is our ability to imagine and enact new possibilities in the pursuit of social change. Now, our imaginations are informed in part by the stories we hear. But stories of social change have seldom been told in ways that bring radical constructive agency into focus. So consider the stories that tend to circulate about struggles for social justice. Some of those stories include violent insurrections. some of those stories are about nonviolent resistance. And even though the means of struggle differ between the first and second set of stories I just mentioned, the storylines are actually similar. An oppressed population engages its oppressors directly in a confrontation, either violently or nonviolently, leading either to victory or defeat. Now, these kinds of stories have shaped our social imaginary when it comes to how people struggle for justice. And of course, those are valid stories. They're real accounts. They reflect the experience of countless revolutionaries and activists, many of whom deserve our deep respect and admiration. But these dominant narratives tend to displace other stories we could also be telling about other ways people can struggle for justice. And to understand the implications of this, it helps again to return to this contrast between constructive and contentious forms of agency. So in the simplest terms, contentious agency is focused on dismantling an unjust social order. Constructive agency is focused on building a more just social order. Now, this distinction doesn't need to be laden with value judgments. In this context, constructive is not a synonym for good, and contentious is not a synonym for bad. Both forms of agency may be needed in the broader scheme of things. But the distinction enables us to notice forms of struggle that otherwise go unnoticed, and to see protagonists who otherwise go unseen, to tell stories that would otherwise go untold, and to imagine futures that would otherwise go unpursued. For instance, the story I first learned in school about the struggle for racial justice in the US is the story of nonviolent protest and civil disobedience that arose in the mid-50s and culminated in the late 60s or early 70s, the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And it's a remarkable story that needs to be told, with countless heroes that deserve our admiration. And more recently, the movement for Black lives is being told as sort of the next chapter in this story of nonviolent resistance, with a new generation of heroes that again deserve our admiration. But what remains largely untold, what I never learned about in school, what I hear little about in the news, are the stories of countless African Americans who struggled for generations to construct elements of a more just social order. Those elements include building schools and colleges, churches and hospitals, libraries, journalism and publishing outlets, businesses and banks, economic cooperatives and associations of mutual aid, along with entirely new patterns of community life, new cultural forms, and new artistic expressions, all that value Black lives. That's radical constructive work in a context like America. Now, these constructive endeavors have also entailed heroic struggle under the most oppressive conditions. Their protagonists have contributed as much to the empowerment of African Americans as campaigns of nonviolent resistance. In fact, these constructive struggles endowed the African American community with many of the material, social, and organizational resources that even made the US civil rights movement possible in the 60s. So how many more widely ignored stories of this nature are waiting to be told, like the constructive agency and resilience of indigenous peoples in the face of settler colonial violence and oppression? Now, one insight we can gain from all these kinds of stories is that radical constructive agency in the face of oppression, just like contentious agency in the face of oppression, is frequently met by acute acts of violent repression. Shouldn't be surprising, I've already alluded to this. When people work to construct elements of a more just social order, those who benefit from the old order will notice, right? And some of those will attempt to defend the status quo by repressing the constructive movement for change. So, constructive movements of African Americans have repeatedly encountered this kind of repression. Think about the destruction of Tulsa, Oklahoma's prosperous Greenwood district and the massacre of its residents in 1921. That's exactly what it was. A violent response to a constructive program. So when we examine in this way the constructive agency of the African American community, we can appreciate the profound resilience that community has also shown while pursuing this constructive program. And as we do this, we can begin to seek out, recognize, and listen to other expressions of constructive agency and resilience throughout history that can expand our social imaginary. So think, for instance, of the earliest Christian communities. As those communities focused on the construction of radically new and more just patterns of community life, they experienced brutal repression that was sustained for generations. And in the face of that repression, their radical constructive agency again required powerful forms of resilience. The same can be said of many other religious communities, especially in their formative years. Now, as we learn to recognize and tell these stories through this lens, we bring to light new insights that can expand our social imaginary and inform our social praxis. So here's another of these insights. Contentious nonviolent tactics, such as civil disobedience in the face of unjust laws, are intended in part to set up a moral dilemma within a population. In the face of that dilemma, those who benefit from unjust laws have to choose to either support or repress the movement for justice. When repression occurs, it often attracts the moral sympathies and support of previously complacent bystanders and third parties, while galvanizing the will of the oppressed to advance the struggle. This is a well understood principle in the theory and practice of nonviolent social change. And it is very purposefully and strategically applied in campaigns of civil disobedience. Now, radical constructive struggles, they don't actually seek to publicly provoke moral dilemmas of this kind, but they can still experience the same kind of repression. And when they're met with that repression, it can again attract the moral sympathies and support of previously complacent bystanders and third parties, while galvanizing the will of those engaged in the struggle. Again, this principle is clearly illustrated by the Baha'i community in Iran, which has encountered a genocidal campaign of repression from its inception, yet continued to grow and advance in a resilient manner, giving rise to a global movement, attracting the support of an ever-expanding cross-section of humanity, now engaged in radical constructive work in literally every country on earth. Every wave of repression Baha'is have encountered in Iran has increased awareness of, sympathy for, and interest in the cause within Iran and around the world. But Baha'is never engaged in performative acts of civil disobedience. Another insight that emerges as we compare constructive and contentious approaches to transformative change is the essential role that learning and training play in both approaches. Among nonviolent resistance scholars and activists, it's now well understood that current movements have to learn from past movements, even as they generate new knowledge and insight within our own social context, which can in turn contribute to the sort of collective store of knowledge that future movements draw on. There's a whole field of social movement learning that's emerged around this understanding today. It's also well understood that movements are most effective when this kind of knowledge is imparted to movement participants through systematic forms of training, which mobilize people to take creative initiatives within a shared framework of activism. Now, all of these processes were seen, for example, when leaders of the US civil rights movement began adapting insights from Gandhi's nonviolent movement in India. And as protagonists of the US struggle for civil rights began generating new insights, they incorporated those into systems of training they were developing to impart these insights to movement participants. Today, similar processes are playing out globally through countless social movements linked to a growing body of literature on nonviolent praxis, promoting, and developing centers of nonviolent training that are multiplying rapidly. Now, the radical constructive agency of the worldwide Baha'i community is advancing through a somewhat parallel dynamic of learning and training. Drawing on a century and a half of its own experience, Baha'is have developed a network of training institutes in every region of the world that prepare and mobilize people to take creative initiatives within a shared framework of activism. This decentralized system makes available an accumulating global body of experiential knowledge, even as local participants contribute new insights to that growing body of knowledge. And this is a body of knowledge about radical constructive agency. One last insight I want to draw out is the way stories of constructive resilience imbue the concept of resistance with a new meaning. Now, within the narrative of contentious agency, resistance is what movement activists engage in response to oppressive social forces. But within the narrative of constructive agency, resistance is what the constructive movement encounters from those defending the status quo. In other words, radical constructive movements for a more just social order are the rivers of historical progress. Those who try to obstruct those currents of progress constitute the resistance, like obstinate stones in the path of a river. But as those rivers of constructive agency grow larger and more powerful, the more irrelevant those stones of obstinate resistance become. So our challenge in this regard is to vastly expand the expression of radical constructive agency in the world today, if we're truly committed to the cause of social justice. And by radical, I don't mean extreme, I mean getting to the root of injustice, because that's what the word radical means, getting to the root of the problem. So we have to vastly expand the expression of radical constructive agency today. We can't just dismantle oppressive social systems and naively assume more just systems will spring up in the vacuum. What history actually demonstrates is those vacuums are easily filled with new forms of oppression. So what we need to learn to do on a much larger scale is construct more just social systems that can supplant oppressive ones. So there is no vacuum. And on that note, I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, so we can have more of a dialogue with the time remaining. So back to you, teacher.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So many rich examples to think about. There is a question here that I'll start with from San Talaba. Many people unfortunately believe that engaging in discussions on social discourse or involving oneself in social action is a political process. Since participation in politics is discouraged in Baha'i discourse, how can one participating in radical constructive agency and not involving oneself in partisan politics? Many outside the Baha'i community consider Baha'is to be passive, i.e., our social actions seem to be hidden or underground from general populations. Please respond.
All right. That's a lot. So let me take, I think there's two different points there. I'll try to engage both. The first is about politics. And it is true, Baha'is are exhorted to refrain from partisan politics. In other words, to refrain from political processes that are divisive, contests of worldly power, so to speak. But Baha'is are not apolitical. In many ways, the entire enterprise of the Baha'i community is a political project because it's about transforming human governance and systems of governance. So one has to distinguish between partisan politics and, in its sort of divisive forms that we're all familiar with, and the broader nature of political engagement, which is about trying to change the world through, systems of governance and such. So I would say, I understand the work that the Baha'i community is engaged in as being quite political, but in a entirely non-partisan way. Now, the question of passivity, again, I think this is really a misunderstanding. Baha'is are there. You certainly, like in any community, can find, let's say, people on a continuum from how active or passive they might be. But the Baha'i teachings unambiguously exhort Baha'is to overcome all forms of passivity and complacency, to arise and dedicate their life, to sacrifice every, thought and action they have towards the betterment of the world. So if there are Baha'is that adopt passive modes, they're not living up to Baha'i standards. If there are people who see the Baha'i community as passive, they fail to understand what the Baha'i community is about. So, yeah, maybe if other people ask more about that, I can go further, but those would be my initial thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. There's another question about Abdul Baha's visit to the United States. For those who don't know, Abdul Baha is the son of the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah. And in 1912, he visited the United States. So this person asks, he encouraged Baha'is to have integrated gatherings or marriage. I don't know if you mean interracial marriage. Were his actions civil disobedience? How do you argue that they were constructive actions?
Well, civil disobedience, first, just to clarify the definition of that term, civil disobedience refers to a performative act, a public performative act designed to break an unjust law in order to challenge it. To set up this moral dilemma I was talking, in which the authorities either to ignore the violation of the law, in which case the law starts to have no meaning or effect, or they repress the activists, in which case they stir up moral sympathy. So civil disobedience is a specific performative tactic, nonviolent tactic, and Abdul Baha was definitely not engaged in that. And in fact, Baha'is are discouraged from engaging in that in any way, that specific kind of tactic. Now, we don't judge others who do. There's a place for many forms of activism in the world. Baha'is have their own lane, and this is not a criticism or a judgment of people who pursue other forms. But Abdul Baha was not engaged in civil disobedience. He did encourage on many occasions with regards to the race relations in the United States. He encouraged Baha'is to be at the forefront of overcoming racial prejudice and segregation and discrimination. He also, in very creative, loving, and thoughtful ways, himself directly challenged certain social norms that were surrounding him as he moved through American society by, for instance, drawing African Americans into spaces that were white only, by social norms, and many other things. So he was, again, Abdul Baha was not passive in by the example of his actions, challenging racist social norms and speaking out on every occasion he could against racial discrimination and prejudice in the United States. But none of those things could be called civil disobedience in the sense the term is generally used. Now, let me add one other thing. In general, Baha'is are exhorted to be obedient to the laws of the lands they live in, which is one of the reasons we don't obey civil disobedience. We think there are other ways to change unjust laws that we can pursue. But there are also some limits to our obedience to the laws of the land. There are certain kinds of laws that violate our fundamental spiritual convictions that we can't abide by. For instance, in parts of the world that have strict forms of racial segregation, Baha'is continue to meet across racial lines. And the same is true, in other sort of situations like that. Or to use other examples, some countries have tried to make it illegal for Baha'is to educate their young. And Baha'is continue to educate their young. But that's not done in a performative public act. These are fundamental spiritual commitments Baha'is believe a government cannot take away from them, like the ability to respect across lines of race or caste or others, those they encounter, or to educate their young, or so forth. But it's different than civil disobedience. There's more subtlety we could explore here, but hopefully that gives some of a sense of these distinctions.
So, for example, when, Abdul Baha was at a large banquet and seated Bliss Gregory at, the right of his hand, and it was his love and his example, but not like performing. The intention was not to make it into a performance, is what you're saying. That's the distinction.
Yeah, not a sort of provocative public performance designed to create an outrage.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. There's a question here. I'm not sure if the meaning. Let's see if you can figure. Does not contentious agency just another form of culture of protest and thus self-defeating? I'm not sure if the person meant does not constructive agents, isn't that just another form of culture of protest and thus self-defeating?
Well, I may or may not, respond adequately if I'm not sure about the question. But let me just say, protest and the culture of protest. Certainly, protests have achieved things in the world. So protests are not all self-defeating. Protests have accomplished things. And again, there's a role for many different kinds of activism in the world today, I think. This distinction between contentious and constructive agency, one way to think of it is, old social forms that consolidate around like unjust, norms. In order to bring about change, those social forms need to become more malleable, need to become able to change after they're solidified. And I think there's an argument to be made that certain forms of contentious resistance and protests can sort of increase that malleability and make open possibilities for change sometimes. So some protests can contribute to these processes. But of course, and I've argued this, I've written about this elsewhere. I wrote a paper called The Paradox of Protest in a Culture of Contest. It's also possible that certain kinds of contentious agency can reinforce certain notions about human nature and about social relationships and about, social organization that can indirectly reinforce some of the root causes of oppression. So this is a sort of complicated topic. I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to read this article, The Paradox of Protest in a Culture of Contest. And part of what I argue in that article is that protests today seem to be reaching a point of diminishing returns. In other words, with every passing year, simply assembling a mass of protesters in some public space and making a loud noise, so to speak, is getting less and less effective. It's partly because oppressive authorities have figured out how to ignore and diffuse and obscure these things, and there are other reasons as well. But so my sense is that kind of mass demonstration protest is reached a point of diminishing returns. It's becoming less effective with every passing year. I don't know if I addressed this question adequately, but those are some initial thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I often wonder, if we were at a crossroads and people argue, well, the actual protesting has gotten us, X, Y, and Z. And what tangible thing do we have to show for on a large scale for constructive agency? So how would you address that, to look at, for example, Black Lives Matter movement? It became global. It raised consciousness in an unprecedented way globally. Could constructive agency have done the same?
I think constructive agency has shaped the modern world in profound ways that we simply don't even recognize often. And of course, the history of these two forces is often intimately bound up, and one has to really try to disentangle them. But let me give you an example that shows, I think, how profound this can be. Now, so think about the founding of this country, the United States of America, which of course is a complicated story that is premised on a genocidal campaign against the indigenous, inhabitants of this country and the enslavement of Africans. And, the original sins go deep in this country. But at the same time, this is a country that embodies certain ideals and aspirations in the form of a kind of a promissory note, as Martin Luther King said, or an experiment that is advancing slowly but surely, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, maybe. Mm-hmm. But there's a dimension of the story that's rarely told, and it's this: most people now. In terms of the formal construction of this country, most people date this, of course, to the War of Independence, and in 1776 and so forth, that period. But the part of the story that's often left out, in addition to the enslavement that began, 1619 and onward, another part of this story that's left out is, before that War of Independence, the settlers on this continent, many of whom themselves were escaping oppression of various kinds in Europe, they began constructing new systems of governance in the colonies. Mm-hmm. And the revolution, as John Adams himself wrote, the revolution is not what founded the American democracy. The revolution was actually protecting and defending a set of institutions that had been constructed in the decades before that. That can be understood as a constructive program. Mm-hmm. That then the revolutionary settlers were defending from European powers, from the British Crown, which was trying to basically destroy it. Now, again, it's a complicated story because of the history of racism and genocide that's also interwoven into that. But it shows an element of what was, a constructive program at play that has clearly left its stamp in the modern world in profound ways. And of course, one can find many other examples around the world of people who have constructed new social systems. Here's an example of a story that's also not told in the United States much. In the turn of the 20th century, because African Americans had been so excluded from the economic systems in this country, mm-hmm. they recognized the value of economic cooperatives as a way of pooling their resources and pulling themselves out of poverty and building economic opportunities and advancement. There was a large African-American cooperative movement afoot in that period. They developed a system of training that included study circles in which groups of Black folks would get together, would learn the basics, the philosophy of economic cooperatives, the practical sort of logistical dimensions. And there were growing numbers of these that, again, played a role in helping to lift African Americans, sort of carry them forward to some extent. So I think there are countless examples. I think the problem is we don't recognize them because we don't have like concepts that enable us to see them and to tell those stories. And of course, they're interwoven into all these other complicated aspects of our history as well.
Mm-hmm. Because age-old thinking we are a product of our society, and the way history is told, the way our educational system has basically taught us is not to think that way.
Yeah.
So
let me give one more example, though. Also,
sure, that's perfect, because it's answering the next question of giving more examples, and then I have one more question.
Okay. So let me go back to the Baha'i community now, just because Perfect. It's a really illuminating case study, so to speak. So there are many things that Baha'is have been building in their, community building and society building sorts of efforts. One is a unique system of governance that I think is one of the most remarkable examples of like constructive agency on the planet today. So let me just briefly describe this and why I think it's so significant. First, let's just think about democracy today, which, if you're living in the United States, which, prides itself as being one of the more advanced democracies on the planet, if not the first and best, I think it's pretty clear to anyone who's half awake that our democratic system of governance is completely failing us. It's simply unable to address the challenges of the moment we live in, which shouldn't be a surprise because our system of partisan democracy was invented literally before, the invention of the steam engine or electricity or the light bulb or airplanes or automobiles or the internet and computers and cell phones and weapons of mass destruction and weapons of mass manipulation. And literally, it might as well be Stone Age in terms of 250 years since it was developed. Have we learned nothing? And the same is true of liberal democracies all around the planet. They are failing us. They're not adequate to the challenges of the moment we live in. So what Baha'is have been developing is an electoral system that we now have 100 years of experience on a local, national, and international scale, electing, at the moment, some, I think, 6,000 to 7,000 local assemblies around the world, almost 200 national assemblies around the world, and an international governing council. And it's a radical experiment in taking democracy to the next step, so to speak. I think this is the basic premise. In a local Baha'i community, every individual is eligible to vote, who's an adult. Every adult's eligible to be elected. And if they're elected, and nobody seeks election, but if they're elected, they serve, which is a sacrifice. So it completely subverts the sort of current understanding of what democracy is. There's no competition in a Baha'i election. None. Zero. No money, no nominations, no campaigns. It produces, it selects 9 people in a locality to serve on a council who didn't even want to serve, but they've been elected because they've demonstrated the qualities of character that people would want serving community. They give up their time and energy and their plans and dreams to engage in that service, and they don't seek to get reelected. Money has no opportunity to corrupt such a system. Partisan divisions have no way to find their way into such a system. So here's a system that Baha'is have been constructing, refining, developing, along with a culture that supports it, as a model and a pattern for future forms of governance that humanity will need. Because Western liberal democracy has become anachronistic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you can't just impose this Baha'i model on the rest of the world, nor would Baha'is try. In fact, it's premised on voluntary participation, but it demonstrates the sort of human capacity to govern in mature ways. And it's a model that Baha'is offer to the world to learn from, even as we continue to sort of expand and develop and refine it. It's an incredible example of a constructive project that addresses the roots of injustice. Because our system of democracy itself in the United States, it's the cause of slavery. It's the cause of indigenous genocide. It's the cause of many of the ongoing sort of injustice we face today. The system is susceptible to corruption and abuse by powerful and privileged, interests. It's incapable ultimately of dealing with the challenges we need to deal with today. And we can't just protest it. We have to develop an alternative.
Indeed. And I think this example really addressed the next question at hand too, but if you wish to expand a little bit more, can you talk about alignment between means and ends in the pursuit of a constructive agenda? How can we measure the alignment? What precautions should be taken to avoid misalignment?
Sure. So there's a really useful concept in social change theory called prefiguration or prefigurative politics. And the idea just is that, the means we use to pursue change prefigure the ends. So if we use violent means, we're going to end up with violent ends and so forth, right? And so this is what coherence between means and ends is about. This is why it's important. Now, if one's adopting then a principled approach to change, if we're trying to create a world characterized by justice, by oneness, by the dignity of every human, being, by peace and shared prosperity, those are principles that we need to use to assess our means. In other words, our means have to be assessed constantly by those same principles that define our ends. So that's a process of intersubjective assessment. We have to continually reflect on our means and ask, are these means still true to these principles which define our ends? And so, we need to be in processes of action, reflection, and learning and refinement in those ways. But let me drill even deeper into this, into why oneness is a central principle for the Baha'i community and why our means are not divisive.
Mm-hmm.
Which, again, is really hard. I mean, I'm in conversation with a lot of social change theorists and activists, and this is the hardest thing for them to get because people assume change takes conflict and division. And Baha'is operate on a different premise. So why might this be important? Well, there's some really remarkable research coming out of a lab at Yale on infant cognitive psychology. And a lab is run by a woman named Karen Wynn, and her husband, Paul Bloom, is also a researcher at Yale, and they collaborate. And they've done some remarkable work on altruism and identity formation. And in a nutshell, and so this will take me a couple minutes, but it really will help illustrate this. In a nutshell, this is one of the things they found. So, humans have this sort of dual nature. We're wired for altruism and cooperation. On one hand, we're wired for egoism and competition on the other. Both of these latent capacities, waiting to spring from us. And of course, which of those capacities develops more fully depends on our social environment and a host of other things. But from infancy, children are capable of expressing cooperation and altruism. It springs out naturally in all sorts of contexts. 6-month-old, year-old, 18-month-old babies, there are ways in which we're learning how to sort of measure and see this. Of course, egoism also springs from babies. Like that's pretty obvious. Okay, so what these studies at Yale and elsewhere are beginning to show is that another thing that begins in infancy is a natural tendency to form in-group and out-group distinctions. And they can form over really trivial things like favorite toys. Who prefers these toys and those toys, can be a distinction around in-group and out-group sort of identity formation among infant, toddlers, or favorite foods, or anything. And what's been like empirically demonstrated again and again and again is altruism and cooperation spring forth quite naturally from infants and toddlers and children. But as soon as an out-group is identified, like an in-group, out-group distinction is made, that distinction dissolves altruism and cooperation with the out-group. So children become, helpful, cooperative with people they perceive as part of an in-group, and the opposite with people they perceive as part of an out-group, no matter what the distinction is. It just so us-them distinctions literally dissolve cooperation and altruism, beginning in infancy and carrying throughout our adult life. And it even gets worse than that. In fact, when people see people from an in-group experiencing pain, they experience empathy. But when people see people from the out-group experience pain, they experience pleasure. And this is like at a, measurable with brain scans.
Wow.
Even over trivial outgroupings like sports fans and other things. So this is so deeply woven into our nature, this like tendency to divide into us and them. And the way it dissolves altruism, cooperation. Now, think about this. The world we want to live in, a just world, requires high degrees of altruism and cooperation across lines of difference. You can't create a just social order if altruism and cooperation dissolve with every, human distinction. Like it's literally, an impossibility. So we cannot create a just social order unless we learn how to transcend the innate tendency towards in-group, out-group distinction drawing. Okay, if we accept that, then how can our means to create a more social, a more just social order begin by drawing in-group and out-group distinctions between oppressor and oppressed, ally and enemy? Like those distinctions themselves reinforce deeply ingrained habits of human cognition that actually make it impossible to create a more just world. So there's this body of science is emerging, this body of empirical evidence emerging that actually, in my mind, lends profound support to the Baha'i conviction that the pursuit of social justice is best pursued through unifying and constructive means that don't reinforce in-group, out-group distinction. And that requires developing a consciousness of the oneness of humanity within which all those other distinctions become sort of subordinate and reconciled, while not erasing diversity and difference, of course, which can then become actually understood as a source of enrichment within a broader framework of oneness.
Wow, that answer or elaboration answered the other questions. And I just want to mention them just so you know what they were. But I can't imagine you going even deeper than this. The question about combining constructive agency and contentious agency, we have really explored that through means and ends, and thank you for that. And just the thing I wanted to share with the UC Berkley and Graduate Theological Union participants who are here with us today, that we're so grateful that Michael Karlberg was so instrumental in the development of a course that we'll be offering this fall, Approaches to Nonviolent Change. And really, Michael, thank you so much for all the inspiration, resources, conceptual framework that you shared that really inspired us to do this. So I really hope that students in these two communities will take advantage of this. And thank you so much for your talk and thought-provoking examples that we really need to, I want to digest and really reflect on, because we have to change the way we think and really, examine, like you said, as we're doing our consultation, action, reflection, are the means and ends in coherence with each other? Because that's where lasting change will emerge. Otherwise, we'll just be in this game over and over and over again. So thank you so much. Now for next month, I wanted to let the friends here know that we will have another speaker, Dr. Arthur Dull, who has extensive experience in sustainability, and he'll be giving a talk navigating the urgent transition towards sustainability, and that will be April 6th at 1 p.m. Pacific. We hope you'll join us. And I wanted to put in the chat box the link for those who would like to register for it. So please help spread the word. Here we go. And feel free to visit the Wilmette Institute's Facebook page and YouTube. This video will be up very soon for you to share with others. And a true heartfelt thanks to Dr. Karlberg for spending his time with us today and illuminating us. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.